Hello, folks. Welcome to the Genuinely Interested podcast. My name is Roy Bensby, and I'm your host. And I want to explain a little bit about the podcast before we start the show this week. This podcast is an opportunity for me to speak with some of the most interesting people I know that I can find on the internet. So, either with amazing talents or achievements or just unbelievable life stories or invaluable insights into areas that they have dedicated their lives to studying. I sit down with these amazing individuals from all across the world. Really, I've talked to people from Slovenia to the Czech Republic to Australia to countries in Africa and South America, really just all over the world. And I try to ask them the questions that will hopefully help you extract something valuable or learn something new or just get inspired by. And I do hope that you do get inspired by these talks with some sort of a call to action, maybe change something that you wanted to change for a while, or even just enjoy, detaching from the world for an hour and listening to some great conversations. So whatever it is that you get from this, I do hope that you extract something from it and enjoy the conversations. All these episodes are available on all the major podcast platforms, iTunes, Spotify, Google, and the rest of them. You can also find the episodes on my website, which is roybensv.com. You can find a lot of other information about me there as well, from photos to a little bit more insights into who I am, if you're interested. And, you can always go to social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me there. I'm pretty active on both those platforms, although the only ones I have. And I try to post regularly so you can stay up to date. And also be sure to put your email on the website. I shoot emails out with updates, news, any new current information that I have will be sent via those emails and social media platforms. So yeah, make sure you're in the loop. Thanks for tuning in this week. On this week's podcast, we have Melissa Cronin. She is a Ph.D. candidate in the Conservation Action Lab at UC Santa Cruz, and she studies ecology and evolutionary biology. Her research mainly focuses on mapping and mitigating marine fisheries bycatch, mainly looking at manta and devil ray bycatch in industrial fisheries. She is also a writer. You could see her stuff in Gawker, Motherboard, Vice, and many, many other publications. So we had a chat about sustainability. Is there a way to be sustainable while eating fish? What are the best methods of sustainability? Talked about bycatch and why it's such a horrific practice and method that a lot of commercial fishing vessels still use, and it's used widely. What bycatch means is for every pound or kilo of fish that is caught, there is 5 pounds or kilos of bycatch. And that could be anything from dolphins to sharks to turtles, et cetera, et cetera. She also discussed with me all these new innovations when it comes to bycatch and how we're reducing it. Super, super interesting. If you guys want to know a little bit more about how to be sustainable with the fish that you eat, we cover all grounds on this topic on this episode. So without further ado, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode. Here is Melissa Cronin. Enjoy the episode, guys.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Hey, Melissa.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm pleased to have you on. Thanks for joining. I've been actually following you for a very long time. I only realized this recently, but I'm very interested in everything you have to say. Very interested in the articles you put out. So I'm happy to have you on.
Great. Oh, thank you. That's really kind of you.
So how did you get into marine biology and studying fisheries? Or just give us maybe a little bit of background.
Yeah, so I have a bit of an odd background for my field. I got a journalism degree in New York, actually, and I started working for publications. Most of it was covering environmental stuff, wildlife trafficking, some fossil fuel development, stuff like that. And I spent a couple years doing that, actually, and it was really rewarding, really interesting, cool kind of stuff. But I felt like I was sort of a generalist and not a specialist in anything. I had a lot of broad knowledge, but nothing really deep.
Yeah.
And it became this kind of, I was covering conservation, and I was just like, you know what, I want to do conservation. I don't want to keep writing obituaries. I want to protect species and systems and human communities too that I care about. So I, on a bit of a whim, applied to a graduate program here in Santa Cruz, and I was super, super lucky to get in. I mean, I don't know how that happened, but it's gone great since then. And and now I'm really immersed in this field of sort of fisheries, sustainability, conservation, manta ray science, all of the above.
Because you're originally from Maine, right? You grew up in a fishing town?
Yeah, Massachusetts and Maine. I sort of say Maine because it was really important to me, but I also grew up in Massachusetts in a really small town. But my grandfather built a cottage in Maine that we spent a lot of time at growing up. And it's on an island that is still a really vibrant, actually, lobster fishery. And anybody who knows lobster fisheries or Maine or that area knows that lobster is like incredibly valuable. It's the second most valuable commodity in the state, or industry in the state, rather, after tourism.
Really?
Yeah, it's really valuable. And the reason why it's so valuable, why there's so many lobsters, is actually because many decades ago, people fished out another fish, the cod, and it was one of the most disastrous fisheries incidents, collapses in the history of the world.
Yeah.
So it's kind of ground zero for fisheries issues. And so after the cod left, lobsters kind of proliferated because they didn't have a predator or competitor anymore. So now we have this like amazing fishery that I grew up around, but it's a really interesting history. It's not really straightforward. It's not really, a simple story. So that was really influential in thinking about how people relate to natural resources and how history is important when you're thinking about the industry, the economy, and even like the way people get food
Yeah.
from the ocean.
I feel like we do that all the time. We'll take up top predators in all these different ecological areas, right? Like from wolves to sharks we're doing with now. Like, how important is it to have that top predator in each ecological area?
Oh, yeah, super important. Yeah, of course. I mean, anybody, if you see those documentaries about Yellowstone, everyone knows
Yeah.
wolves were really the keystone to keeping the ecosystem going. And it's the same in the ocean. Predators like cod or, for instance, sharks, coastal sharks, are really, really important to sort of regulation and overall community health of the system. And interestingly, the ocean is it's the last place where large scale hunting still happens. So most of the protein that we get from land systems is farmed, right? But the ocean is still this not domesticated place where we have predators, where we hunt really hard in some cases. And by hunting, I just mean usually fishing.
Yeah.
And so we're still going after those big predators in the ocean, whereas on land, we've pretty much extirpated most of them, at least on sort of large scales.
Yeah, because I mean it's kind of the Wild West, right? You have the ocean area where there's not really any monitoring. It doesn't really belong to any one nation, and they're just who are maybe the leading countries doing this, or is it just independent contractors or companies?
Oh, there's many, many. That's a big question. So the system that I mostly work in is, as you say, it's on the high seas, which is past the 200 mile marker from a country's border. So every country has their own border, their own waters, and then past that is the high seas.
Okay.
And you're right to say there's like not really, it's a little bit of a Wild West out there. There are management bodies that are essentially groups of countries that come together and they try to manage a fishery. So, or even sometimes like a resource, maybe drilling or whatever. But they are generally thought of as pretty, they're not always doing a great job in a lot of different ways. Whether it's, stuff that I work on, which is accidentally capturing endangered and threatened species, whether it's actually managing a fishery the right way, whether it's human labor, human rights, stuff like that. So there's a lot of problems out there.
Yeah.
But and just to to answer your question, the countries that are, it depends on the ocean, the countries that are usually managing it, but generally we have what's referred to as like closer states, so states or countries that are fishing nearby their own waters, and then what's called distant water fishing nations, and those are fishing nations that travel like 3,000 miles to get to a fishing ground. And that obviously introduces problems where the fish comes from so far away, it's hard to trace, it's often a really wealthy country coming in. So yeah, it depends where you're looking, but many, many countries fish those waters.
Yeah, because I know I had Captain Paul Watson from Sea Shepherd on many months ago. Actually, he's a very eccentric and interesting guy. Um, and he was saying a lot of vessels coming from Japan, coming from the Scandinavian nations, and I mean they do a fairly good job by stopping them. But there's only so much they can do. They have, I think, two, three ships, not a lot. They have a handful of ships. So there's only so much they can do to stop these countries. But he did say that Japan and the Scandinavian nations are some of the biggest culprits when it comes to this, especially with whales.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's right to say that those are big fishing nations, but there are also other nations, including the U.S., which are taking a lot of fish and really actively and aggressively fishing.
Mhm.
Um, I think I interviewed him once when I was doing journalism. It was really interesting, but I think he's working a lot on whaling and international whaling, which is a really interesting issue because it's most countries sort of frown on whaling. There's
Yeah,
a moratorium, but in my system of tuna, high seas tuna fishing, most countries are still aggressively pursuing tuna for sashimi and sushi, but also for canned tuna. And so, like the U.S., for instance, is a great example where we have a big tuna market, and to think that it's only Japan is really letting us get away with something. I think, and a lot of like us, a lot of developed countries, the European Commission, Spain, are really big fishing countries, big fishing nations, and certainly have a really big role to play in protecting the sustainability of the species and the ones that are accidentally killed in the process.
yeah. I mean, is there a sustainable way to eat fish nowadays? I mean, we're a growing population. We're going to hit, I think, 10 billion by 2050. Developing nations are going to want more protein, just like us, just like we eat them. And there's only so many resources that we can allocate for everyone. And it seems like every time I hear about fisheries, it's like 90% are gone, this is gone, this one's collapsed. And is the sustainable thing just not eating fish, or is there a sustainable way to eat fish?
So it's a really good question, and it's the one that everybody always wants to know. Like, how do I eat sustainably? There's a couple answers to that. I think if there are successfully managed fisheries, particularly the U.S. is well known for successfully managing its local fisheries. So if you live in a coastal area, the best way to know that your fish is sustainable is to know who caught it and how it was caught. So if you can go to, a local market that sources local seafood, if you can join a community supported fishery, a CSF, which is sort of a group of fishermen who might sell directly to consumers or through one buyer, that is like the best way to know that not only was it probably sustainably caught because it's local, or at least you can investigate it, but you also know that there's no labor rights violations that were involved in the creation of your seafood product,
Yeah.
and you avoid the enormous amount of fossil fuels that are released when we do some of this offshore industrial fishing. So people ask me like, how do I know if my tuna is sustainable, or if my seafood is sustainable? If you know where it was caught and it's local to you, that's the best way to approach the problem. There are other things like, seafood labels and stuff like that. Those tend to be pretty complicated and variable. So I
Yeah.
often encourage people to just go by the label. There's a lot of problems associated with different labels and with different fisheries, and you don't always know what you're getting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a long answer to say that if you know where the fishery is and that you can trace back less than say 4 steps between you and the product, that's generally a good metric, though obviously hard to do.
But should we try to eat less or potentially not eat at all or just manage how much we eat?
I
Or
think
maybe eat certain fish only?
yeah, yes, definitely. So I would say if you're eating, tuna, swordfish every day, that's not a sustainable way to live. If you're eating things, small fishes like anchovy, sardines, sort of oily fishes, mackerel, the production of those is much, much less harmful to the environment. So we're taking out, like you talked about, we're taking out small prey fish rather than big predators, which are important and generally more vulnerable. So people, like there's a whole culture in Spain of eating these small fish, and
Yeah.
I love to see people like being creative about that stuff. Um, and yeah, that's all I would say about that, I guess. And I have really developed a taste for those fish, but it took a little while. You have to like mix them with mayonnaise and stuff. But they're really good and they're an amazing source of protein and generally have way less contamination than something like a tuna, which is super high contamination.
Well,
Um,
that's the other thing. A lot of these fish, I remember what documentary was this? Potentially, I think it was The Cove, where they were in Japan, right? They were fishing these dolphins, super high in mercury, and they were selling it off as a different fish. But a lot of fish do have mercury, and they do have plastic from plastic pollution because they're just eating all this plastic. So it's not even that it's as healthy potentially as maybe it was 20, 30 years ago, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It would depend on the fish, but after the Industrial Revolution, we've been seeing higher and higher levels of contamination. And you bring up a good problem, which is mislabeling or misidentification of seafood. Just like we want to know where our vegetables come from, what types of pesticides were used with them, or if you do eat meat, where your meat comes from, whether it's been fed grass or not. We want to know what's happened to the product that we put inside our bodies. And yeah, the best way to avoid the types of contamination problems, which are really variable and it's almost impossible to know, like the level of contamination you're getting in your food, is to avoid those large species, which we call high trophic level species, tuna, swordfish, salmon, super high levels of contamination. And it's sometimes impossible because of the mislabeling problem. So especially with
Yeah.
whitefish, you can not really know what you're getting. It's funny, just here in Santa Cruz, we have a program to test the meat that's sold in local grocery stores or the seafood that's sold in local grocery stores.
Really?
It's mislabeled. It's like high schoolers doing this cool work, very simple analysis, but they're awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, with a colleague of mine who runs it. And, they found that there's really high levels of mislabeling, even in a very progressive place like Santa Cruz. We're known
Yeah.
for really good food policy. So I wouldn't ever assume that your seafood is accurately labeled, certainly. So you might not know where you're getting.
Yeah. And also, I mean, food labels are just so confusing and so misleading in general. This is how they make their money, right? They'll just write a lot of buzzwords like farm fresh and I don't know. There's a lot of buzzwords that don't really mean anything for the most part.
Yeah, right, right. Which is why it's so important to, if you're going to eat seafood, to know, at least the fishery, if not the person where it came from. And I will say that there is an argument to be made for, really well managed fisheries, well managed coastal small scale fisheries that have people, fishermen especially, who care for the resource and want to protect it because it's part of their livelihood. So if you can support that with your buying power, then that's a great thing to do. That's a great thing for the fishery and for the ecosystem. That being said, all of this is like what the consumer can do. But really, a lot of these problems are large scale policy and political problems. And so, like, I think the best thing you can do for sustainable seafood is pressure governments to enact better policies, better regulations, and not allow people to overfish or to unsustainably fish in the first place.
So, how much of a problem is bycatch? I know for the stats that I've seen are for every, I believe, kilo of catch, there's 5 kilos or is it pounds of bycatch, right? So this is everything from manta rays, dolphins, sharks, sea turtles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And is that something that government regulation could change?
Yeah. So you're right. It's a huge problem. It's a problem that is really, different depending on the context of the fishery. So the gear makes a difference. What you get with a different type of gear, the target species, so whatever you're fishing for, and then the vulnerability of the species, that the bycatch species. So I work on the bycatch of manta rays and devil rays, which are together referred to as mobile rays. And they face a lot of different threats. Target fisheries, there's a market for their gills. They are impacted by plastic pollution. But bycatch is particularly pervasive for them because they are enormous. When you catch one in a net, it's really difficult to release it quickly. So often they'll bring it on board and the animal will die while on board. They're also really, really slow growing. They have only one pup every couple years. So
Wow.
they're much more like a dolphin than another fish, even though they're technically a fish.
Yeah.
So they're kind of like a bycatch nightmare species where they're just really vulnerable and then they're frequently caught. So they're caught in a lot of different gear. I study them in this tuna fishery. It's called a purseine fishery. And they're captured in the thousands every year. And it's a huge problem. So to answer your question, there are things that governments can do. There are multiple things that need to happen for the species. The first, and that's something that we're working on, is just trying to understand the impact and where it's happening most and how that sort of reverberates through the population. So I'm doing this genetic study to try to isolate which populations we need to work on first. Then we're working with the fishery to actually try to develop different operational ways they can fish to reduce the mortality of the bycatch. So we're trying to see, can they handle them differently to increase the survival after the catch? Or, and probably more importantly, can they actually avoid catch in the first place?
Yeah.
So that's all the things that we're working on. But then, you're right to point out that politically, we need political will to make these things happen. And we need those countries at the table in these high seas fisheries bodies to say, look, this is a priority for us. And we don't want to be involved in sort of like the decline and eventual local extinctions for these species.
Are these vessel owners or operators cooperative, or are they like, oh, you environmentalists, you're trying to get into my bottom line and, screw you, et cetera, or do they want to work with you?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I'm sure they say that stuff behind closed doors. It's a mixed bag for sure. There are certainly, we've had great collaborators, especially in some work we're doing in Ecuador, amazing collaborators from a very large fishery who are really interested in reducing the bycatch. And interestingly, some of their motivation from that is to get a sustainability certification. So that's a place where those certifications can play a really great role in incentivizing some research, at least. In other cases, it's not always easy to get large scale change at this like enormous like ocean basin level.
Yeah.
It's certainly slow going, and these bodies are not really known for their speed of action.
Yeah.
So it's been an interesting process. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. But definitely something that's worth noting is that the tuna industry, like all fisheries, are profit industries. So it's not always the case that our incentives are aligned.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, their whole thing is, and I mean, I don't know how much. I'm sure there's different methods, but I know one of the methods is this massive net that you just cast on the bottom of the ocean, and it just literally sweep everything.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter if it's, I don't know, fish, bird, whatever is there, it ends up in the net, and that's probably one of the biggest causes of bycatch, right?
Yeah. I think you're referring to trawling, which is
Trawling. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really invasive form of fishing and has not only, habitat problems for, as you say, sort of sweeping the bottom, scraping the bottom, It also captures something like sea turtles, mammals, kind of everything in its way. It's a good example too, because at least in some trawl fisheries, they've had really serious sea turtle bycatch problems.
Hmm.
And they've actually developed this amazing method to release sea turtles from the net, but it's a sort of a grid system. And it's become pretty successful in terms of reducing sea turtle mortality. So that's actually a great example because it was a huge problem. I mean, it still is a problem for many places and for other species. But at least in, say, the Gulf of Mexico, they've reduced sea turtle bycatch significantly just by doing this kind of innovation. So it's something we hope to do for manta rays in a similar kind of method. But it's only part of the solution, the gear change, because we need, political will. Like I said, we need, in some cases, reduction of effort, of fishing effort. So, yeah.
And I think we need like a group or a body to get behind a certain fish, right? I feel like when people got behind whales, it made a change. When we get behind any animal, doesn't matter if it's sharks or dolphins or polar bears, right? When we make some sort of a campaign around it, then people start, you change minds and hearts. People don't want to buy that specific fish, or they want to ensure that that animal has a good life and is, maintained in its wilderness. I feel like that's what it's missing. Like it's missing a good PR person to kind of push its story to the forefront.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it would be cool if people started thinking about, say, something like tuna as, a really incredible predator. We call them, they're sort of like this like lion of the ocean because they're a top predator. They're incredibly strong and fast. They even, people think of fish as cold-blooded, but they actually heat their own brains so that they can dive really deep. Yeah, they're like pretty hardcore predators. So it would be cool if people start to shift to think about them as, species that deserve to be in the ocean, and that not just as a resource for us to exploit like oil. And the same thing goes for manta rays, which are, incredibly beautiful, charismatic animals. So it's not always hard to get people on board for them, but they're highly threatened. And I think sometimes thinking about them as part of the capture of your tuna sandwich is perhaps not a nice image, or not something that people want to be a part of.
Yeah. What kind of led you down the road to get interested in manta rays? Because you specifically focus on manta rays, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So my lab here at UC Santa Cruz, the Conservation Action Lab,
Yeah.
has actually been doing research on a species of devil ray, which are very closely related, for, gosh, now like 15 years. They have a really wonderful research program going on in Mexico. And that species is really amazing, really interesting. It does these really beautiful jumps out of the water that we haven't seen. It's a great Google. And so they were thinking about, this is a sort of coastal population, but of course there's a connection between this high seas fishery and then the local populations. And so there was sort of an opportunity to work at this tuna level, and having that experience, growing up in Maine and really seeing fishery sustainability and all of the kind of political, economic, social, and then of course biological stuff that goes into it, I was like, yes, sign me up. So it just sort of fell into place. And then we've since expanded it to kind of cover a greater breadth. So we have the genetics project, we have a sort of a review paper, we've got a policy piece. So yeah, it's pretty interdisciplinary. I like my journalism. I'm still a broad scientist, but that's okay.
Do you enjoy, or maybe how is your work split up? Is it like 50-50 in the field and then in the lab, or 80-20? And which one do you kind of enjoy more? Do you enjoy coming back and testing the results and seeing, the hypothesis come to life? Or do you enjoy being out in the field, in the ocean, and the wind in your hair?
What an easy answer. Yeah. I mean, the field is totally spectacular, and especially one of the coolest things has been to see the way fishermen relate to the issue and to trying to help solve it. That has been really cool. especially in a little bit of work that I've just been, there for in Baja, where the fishermen are incredibly invested in sustainability and, in fact, like leading conservation efforts, which has been super, super cool. And then working with this large scale fishery has also been really interesting. Because of the nature of the vessels where they go out for months at a time, I'm not doing the physical sample collection. So I train observers who go on the vessels to do that for, time restraints and other considerations.
Yeah.
So it's less like romantic. And then we do a lot of lab work, a lot of like pipetting until your brain explodes, which is interesting. It's certainly a good skill, but perhaps not the most, not the movie version of my research.
Yeah. Not Indiana Jones out there trying to collect samples.
Oh, God, no. Though I do have a tie-dye lab coat with
Okay.
Santa Cruz. And
Yeah. So this is my idea. Tell me how ridiculous it is, right? When in COVID now, right? We saw in India, we saw, I think in LA and in China and a lot of other places, carbon emissions went down drastically, right? Everyone was home, air travel banned and people not driving as much, so less consumption. All of a sudden, people were like, oh, I can see mountains, I can see the sky, there's not as much air pollution. Could we do something similar as far as some sort of a moratorium to maybe 6 months out of the year or 3 months or whatever it is, people don't eat fish, right? Or don't eat a certain type of fish, or don't, just limit what people can eat. I know it's impossible to tell people what to do and what not to do. I understand that everyone should be able to do what they want. But if it's, the future of fish, the future of the oceans, could we see something like that being implemented? B, would that even help?
Well, certainly reducing, global demand especially for some of these large predatory species would be great. Yeah, for sure. And I think the idea to, limit demand to impact supply is a really good one. In terms of feasibility, it might be difficult, but crazier things have happened.
Yeah.
There are big efforts now to put in marine protected areas where fishing is either not allowed or highly regulated, or do seasonal closures, which is kind of what you're talking about, where seasonally, when we know, say there's a manta ray aggregation in this area, we don't fish there because we know the risk is too high. So that's sort of being done in this like more supply side of things. And I think it's really probably the most promising thing we have is to avoid the bycatch in the first place. Yeah, I haven't heard, sort of a demand moratorium. But again, it goes back to this point about like the role of consumers. And I think consumers do have a really important role to play.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like if you or I don't eat seafood for a day, it doesn't really change the fact that they're going out fishing. And it's a great example in COVID because, interestingly, at least in the beginning, a lot of small scale fishers weren't going out, weren't selling catch, but industrial fisheries were. And as far as I know, there wasn't a huge decline in the amount of effort from industrial fisheries. And in fact, there were a lot of fisheries where they weren't sending out observers who are data collectors, essentially. Vessels. So it was almost worse, where they're going out fishing and potentially have less oversight.
The lawlessness increased.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not what we want, especially if, data is already a problem in this field. So having sort of even more Wild West is not a good thing.
Yeah. I figured my idea wouldn't work, but I think maybe it will work. Maybe in the East, because even like if you look at Taiwan, right? I think they have like 24, 25 million people, 585 cases of COVID and 7 deaths, right?
Wow.
Compare that to New York. I mean, it's incomparable, right? I think they just listen to government. And even, I was in Japan earlier this year. Everyone was wearing masks, literally everyone. And I don't know, maybe this is just custom and this is the culture there. And they were already doing it pre-COVID, but everyone was. And this was just right in the beginning where a few people from China were coming into Japan. So I don't know if, they were scared and they were worrying, but it just seems like they're more compatible with change and they tend to listen to government. Where here, I think in the West, we're very anti-government. We don't want government butting in and telling us what to do and, give us our freedom and liberty. So, yeah.
And it's funny, culture is actually really important for seafood consumption too. And for like all these sustainability issues, like a great example is I'm Irish Catholic from the Northeast, right? And there was after the Catholic Church recommended that Catholics have fish on Fridays, no meat on Fridays.
Oh yeah.
There was a huge spike in seafood consumption after that. I can't forget the year. I think it was back in the 40s or 50s or something.
Yeah.
And, that led to people seeing fish more frequently and saying, oh, this is actually pretty good, and eating more fish. And then a subsequent increase in demand.
Really?
For those products. Yeah. So, these things that we think are not related, social, religious, cultural norms, actually do impact the type of fish we want to eat. Especially in the US, we eat a lot of the same type of fish over and over, where a lot of other cultures will take advantage of things that for us seem more gross. Gooey duck is a great example. Not a lot of people eat that, but it's actually sustainable seafood products. So yeah, I think culture is actually so important in terms of thinking about conservation and seafood demand and supply. Yeah.
Do you think, and I don't know how closely you potentially follow this, but do you think that maybe plant-based alternatives and or lab-grown, now they have lab-grown meat, but I'm sure at some point they'll have lab-grown fish as well. Are those alternatives that could be, viable options?
Yeah. Oh gosh, certainly. And especially if it's replacing something like a predatory fish like a tuna, or certainly replacing a factory farmed animal, which we know are one of the highest contributors to greenhouse gas, fossil fuel emissions, and climate change. My God, yeah, absolutely. I think if we can have something that's not that and reduce demand especially for factory farm meat or for industrially caught seafood, then that's great to me. And, my dad is a real meat eater, and I gave him Beyond Burger, I think it was, or Impossible Burger. And he was like, wow, this is
it is. It's delicious.
Yeah, I think they're getting really great. There's always trade-offs with those things where the introduction of one thing has XYZ drawbacks, but it sounds like, at least from what I've seen, that those are really promising alternatives, and maybe, we can shift more deeply to those.
Yeah. And I mean, it's never going to be zero. It's never going to be perfect. It's just, can we do better than what we're already doing? And I think and it goes back to what you said earlier, culture. I think once we have the lab grown meats, that's going to be a little bit of a cultural switch that people are going to have to, I don't know if I can eat something grown in a lab. I prefer, I think it's more organic or more whatever, the slaughtered animal. So that's a mentality, a culture shift that's going to have to happen as well. I think it can happen fairly quickly if all the tests are shown that it's just as healthy and better for the environment. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think we can get there.
Yeah, I would try it. And it's another reminder of there's these bottom up and these top down forces. A good example is subsidies. So we highly subsidize industrial fishing and often farming practices. And, consumers can be the ones that sort of say, oh, look, we want this product instead of this product that we don't like the way it's made or what its impact is. And then governments should respond and reduce these harmful subsidies that, at least in the fishing sector, are out of this world. I mean, mind-boggling, and contribute to this constant overexploitation of the oceans. So I think if those two things sort of meet in the middle, then that's where you get real and lasting change.
Did you see the octopus documentary?
No, I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen it?
I'm so behind on my movie. Yeah.
You're behind on your Netflix documentary. It was a pretty cool documentary. The thing that I took away from it was that the octopi,
I think
plural,
octopuses actually.
octopuses.
Crazy
Okay,
enough.
yeah, okay, then yeah, they are unbelievably complex creatures, and that kind of got me thinking: how many other creatures are there in the ocean, fish, mammals, etc., that are just so complex, and we just have no understanding of them because they're underwater and we're above water.
Right.
And the other thing was that he kept going to this kelp farm to find this octopus. And the funny part and this is in off the coast of, I think it was Cape Town in South Africa, or maybe somewhere in that area. The kelp farm, the water was always crystal clear, like super clear, but everything around it was kind of murky.
Hmm.
And I was wondering if the kelp was actually kind of cleaning the water.
Yeah, I don't know specifically about kelp farming, but there's a lot of promising research around kelp, and then also like bivalves like clams and oysters, and about greater greater water quality nearby. But I mean, just to comment on your example of the octopus, that's so right. There's such a terrestrial bias in the way we think about, intellectually and emotionally about animals that live in the ocean or even in freshwater. So manta rays, my species that I study, are a great example where they're fish, yes. So people have a hard time relating sometimes, but
Yeah.
they have the largest brain to body ratio of any fish, meaning that for the size of their body, their brain is enormous.
Yeah.
And they have these super complex social relationships, complex mating and courtships, these beautiful dances that they do and sort of chasing that they do to attract a mate or say, look, I'm like the strongest guy in the group. So they're really complex. And I don't think that we fully understand the real depth of their cognitive ability. And they're hard to study. So, I mean, it makes sense that we don't understand it, but it doesn't mean that we should assume that the default is that they're not intelligent or they're not capable of social interaction.
No,
Yeah.
they're super smart. It's unbelievable. And again, like I just the way he did it was so amazing because he just got so much footage, and I guess he went there every day for like a year, I believe it was, and interacted with this octopus, and he got so much amazing foot, and you could really see the trust that he built over time. And that's, we the only animal we really interact with is a dog or a cat, right? Otherwise, like we don't really interact with animals on a regular basis, so we just assume all these things about them.
Right.
But I think scientists like yourself and others, and maybe people like David Attenborough and Nat Geo photographers, and when they document them and they spend a long time with certain types of animals, you really see that, oh, okay, they're actually much, much more complex, much, much smarter, and have these social webs and connections that we just had no clue about.
Yeah, and doesn't it make it easier to, not care about that animal or that system when you're so divorced from it? So like in food production, a lot of times people have no idea where their meat, where their plants or where their fish comes from. And that's part of the problem. We don't see these places, we don't see the destruction that it causes. And so it becomes really easy to eat, say, Nutella, which we know is associated with horrific oil palm plantations and the destruction of habitat for orangutans and other like amazingly endangered and beautiful and interesting species. And I think that the way that we're so disconnected from our food production is a huge part of the problem. It's really easy to ignore if you don't see it.
Yeah. Do you think that we potentially judge which animals to save based on maybe cuteness rather than necessarily ecological importance?
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. There's a lot of research to support that.
Really?
Even the amount of, conservation dollars that are spent, the research that's done. So like manta rays and devil rays are two different species groups way more research is done on manta rays because they're larger and like people love that. I mean, they're incredible.
Yeah.
And so I get it. It makes sense that if something is like a panda, everybody wants to keep it. That totally is natural to me. But it doesn't mean that the other species that we ignore are less valuable to the ecosystem. So there's a cool field of conservation sort of triage where they're trying to identify species who are, ecosystem wide valuable, maybe ecologically valuable, maybe economically valuable for, say, something like tourism,
Yeah.
and use different metrics besides just like how cute they are to prioritize them for conservation. And, I can't say too much because I study a charismatic species and I get a lot of flack for that in the scientific world. But it's totally a pervasive problem.
Yeah. I mean, we love it. We love a good teddy bear.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I actually had one in my backyard about a month ago. A cute, big, fluffy black bear kind of tapped on my window, and they're big. They're big boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Spooky. But I'm sure, that really is a cool experience to have. And
Oh, it's amazing.
think more about, oh, well, we should make sure that this, park is established or protected because I like having him there. I like seeing him. But you would never think the same about, I don't know, tuna or something because
No.
you never see it. So it's hopefully a good reminder to keep making creative work like podcasts or films that allow people to experience these amazing animals and feel more connected to them.
What? Because 2020 has been, as everybody knows, pretty crappy year. What are you most hopeful about in your field? Where are you seeing kind of real strides?
Yeah, well, gosh, that's a hard question. I,
Give us some hope, Melissa. Come on.
I do have hope. I mean, I wouldn't be in this field in conservation if I didn't think that things would change. That
Yeah.
would be pointless. And I have hope about people, at least in some countries, really demanding better from their food production systems. So people saying, oh, you know what? I don't want dolphins to die in the production of my seafood or manta rays. Or for that matter, I don't want to support factory farming, which we know is terrible for animals, for the environment, and for the people who work in it. And so I see these pushes. There's a push against seafood slavery. There's a push against terrible conditions at factory farms, and then all the environmental consequences of the both of these.
Yeah.
I see people getting sort of enraged about these things, and that's really exciting and hopeful because I think that we should be enraged about them. And I think that in the past, these big movements have really resulted in great change for the environment. Rachel Carson's DDT book, Silent Spring, that was huge and led to the creation of, serious legislation. So I think that with enough pressure and enough people banging on the door, things do happen. And it's not that they're always going to just lie down and say, sure, I'll change my business model for you. Sometimes it really needs to be real aggressive pressure.
Yeah.
So I have hope. I do have hope. Maybe a slow process.
No, we need hope. I think more than ever, 2020 showed us how important having hope is. Because otherwise, let's just leave it at that.
And the year is the majority over. So
yeah, I just hope it just doesn't extend into 2021, and then it's a 2020 extension. I'm hoping. Not that I think this is what's going to happen, but I'm just hoping that 2021 is just fresh, just new start. But
yeah, and sometimes I do think this is an interesting moment in history. I mean, terrible one for so many people. But it's an interesting reset. I mean, sometimes a shock to the system can be sort of a clarifying moment when you say, oh, what are the things that I do need? I do need human connection. I do need community. I do need my work to make me happy. And I think sometimes maybe a shock can be good for systems, although it's certainly a painful one.
It is, and that's a really important point that you brought up. As far as human connection, I think that's one of the biggest things. All these lockdowns, all these quarantines, all you're not being, scared to see your parents or your grandparents or even friends. That's something I think that a lot of people will really appreciate now, that they can't hug people, that they can't be close to their relatives, to their loved ones. That's a biggie. That's a real big point that I don't think we ever thought about. Oh, what? I'm not going to be able to see my parents? Like, in what world does that exist? But it exists now.
Yeah, right. Totally. I know. I really miss my family. But again, it's like, yeah, I mean, even sharing food, I think a lot about like food, and we can't share food anymore, and what an important cultural thing that is. But I'll say that the way that we've seen some, like you mentioned before, environmental metrics sort of improve in terms of quality or health, that to me is super hopeful. If we're talking about hope, it's such a sign that, okay, things can change if we have political will and enough power.
Yeah.
Things can get better quickly, way quicker than I could have imagined.
So I know you have a hard stop, so I'll just ask you the final question. And this I saw on your website, so I had to ask this. What did you learn from watching 540 hours of Survivor and why?
Yikes. Yeah, I was a real big Survivor fan for a long time. um, like that story says, I maintain my position that environmental education and communication about endangered species does not need to be boring. It does not need to be in a documentary, even if that documentary is amazing. We can get this content into non-traditional methods, which I think Survivor is one. So, having watched more than 500 episodes, I know that there are endangered species. There are species that I never have seen on a documentary. I think that the depth of species they show is really actually pretty impressive, and that they should be awarded for that. Though there are problems with Survivor. I'm the first. And
Who would have thunk?
but
Yeah, I've never watched it. But I might check out an episode now that you mention it. I just might.
Conservation eye, if anything else. And yeah, I think we need to think creatively about the way we communicate to people. And that's a good example, I think, as any. Like, it doesn't all have to be in a textbook. And sometimes the way to get people on board is through a reality show.
Yeah, I guess whatever gets eyeballs, right?
Exactly. Yeah, in a constructive way, I think. Yeah.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I had a blast, really. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, having me.
Where can people find you on the internet? Where's the best places?
Yeah, they can check out my website, which is melcronin.com, Cronin. And then my Twitter is at Melissa_Cronin. And I'm often tweeting about, whatever is enraging me that day or manta ray photos. So hopefully you can come for one or the other.
Yeah, guys, make sure to check her out. Melissa's awesome. So give her a follow. And thanks again. I really had a blast. Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks so much.